Well, what we've realized is that the level of global warming at which dangerous effects will come into being is lower than what we thought a few years ago. So targets to keep global warming less than 2 degrees Celsius are actually disaster scenarios, because the last time it was 2 degrees Celsius warmer was the Pliocene, when sea level was about 15 meters higher, and it was quite a different planet than the one we see now.
One of the things that struck me was your forecasts for what needs to be done in order to get CO2 back to 350 parts per million, and how more difficult that becomes if you delay doing anything about it for only a matter of a few decades. Just explain that.
Yeah, if we had started in 2005 to reduce our emissions, we could have reduced them 3% a year and stabilized climate this century. If we start now, it requires 6% per year emissions reductions. If we wait another 10 years, it becomes 15% per year, which is impractical. So we really need to start soon.
Now, you want 6% cuts in emissions starting now.
Yeah, starting next year.
The obvious problem is that despite incredible amounts of rhetoric by politicians and the Kyoto Summit and the Kyoto Treaty and all the rest of it, we aren't cutting emissions, and that it's just not going to happen next year.
Well, it's not going to happen as long as we continue to subsidize fossil fuels and do not put a price on them to make them pay their cost to society. If we would simply do that with a gradually rising price or tax or fee on fossil fuels, then we would begin to phase them out and move to clean energies.
But you're talking initially of, say, $15 per ton of emitted CO2. Have you done any calculations of what that would mean in terms of, for example, people's electricity bills, or what it would do to a ticket to fly across the Atlantic?
What it would do, in the United States, the most relevant number is, what does it do to the price of petrol at the station? Well, after 10 years, it would amount to $1 a gallon. But
how much is petrol in the United States at the moment?
It's about $4 a gallon now.
Okay.
But that would reduce our emissions by 30% at the end of 10 years, the economic models show. So that's much more effective than any of these cap and trade with offset schemes, which amount to nothing in the end.
The problem you have, though, is that in order for this to work, it's got to affect people. It's got to hurt.
Yes.
I mean, if you could take the comparison with the so-called Tobin tax on the idea of taxing financial transactions on a global scale, it's at a fractional rate. The argument is you'd raise billions of revenues, but no one would ever really notice. But that would defeat the purpose of yours. People have to notice.
Precisely. It has to be a tax which is enough that it's going to affect people's choices. But if the money that is collected is distributed to the public on a per capita basis, so the person that does better than average in limiting their fossil fuel use will actually get more in their monthly dividend, then the public would allow it. But if the money is taken by politicians and they get to decide which lobbyists they will distribute the money to, then the public is not going to allow that. They will throw out anybody from office if they do that.
I come back to the point that it's sort of gone off the agenda. I mean, you presumably must be disappointed in the Obama administration, because unlike the previous administration, they made all the right noises, but nothing much has happened.
Yeah, precisely. It's politics as usual, and the effectiveness of the people who prefer to see business as usual continue. The effectiveness in keeping the public confused. But we will have to fix this soon, or our children and grandchildren will suffer the consequences. And Mother Nature is going to help, because the climate effects are becoming more apparent. What used to be a 3 sigma event, what we call a very unusual warm season, which occurred only a couple tenths of 1% of the time, is now occurring about 10% of the time. The person who is observant can see that the climate is beginning to change.
One of the points that you yourself make is that you have to calculate the effects of carbon emissions over the the life cycle of carbon in the of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which I think I'm right in saying makes us in Britain have the proud distinction of being more responsible for global warming than anyone else, even though it was that was historical.
On a per capita basis, Great Britain is most responsible, the United States is next, and Germany is third. Because it's the excess CO2 in the atmosphere today, not the current rates of emission, that are changing the climate. So we have a responsibility, and frankly, Britain is beginning to take some steps. I think that you are stopping the building of more coal-fired power plants. That's a major step in the right direction.
I wouldn't be quite as optimistic as you seem to be in that front, but there we are. There are one in England was cancelled. There are proposals to build coal-fired power plants in Scotland with carbon capture and storage. The only problem with that is we know how to do the coal plants, and we don't know how to do the carbon capture and storage.
Yeah, that's right. If they really capture all or almost all of the CO2, then that might make sense, although I think that will make it so expensive that they won't do it. But to pretend, by saying, oh, we're going to capture 15 or 20%, that's a hoax. You have to capture it all or else it doesn't make sense.
You would prefer a mix of renewables and new forms of nuclear energy, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I think that we need, for baseload electric power, we need next generation nuclear power, which can be much safer and which can burn nuclear waste and solve that major problem with nuclear power.
What do you say to people, and there are a lot of people who criticize the fact that you've become something of an activist on this rather than just a scientist? I mean, you don't just write papers, you now get arrested outside the White House seemingly on a fairly regular basis. And some of you, I think some people who sympathize with your views are saying, look, you're selling the past, you're compromising your position as one of the world's leading scientists on climate change by, in effect, behaving like some kid at university who was out in a demonstration.
Well, I think the science has to stand on its own merits, and there are ways that the scientific community has of reviewing science. But, well, I think it's irresponsible if not to point out the consequences of the climate change. So I don't understand the objections. You know, I have children and grandchildren, and I think I have a responsibility to them. Not just to do the science, but to point out what is the consequence.
All right, we'll leave it there, Luke. Jim Hansen, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.